Welcome to At Issue. My name is H. Wayne Wilson. We're so glad that you're able to join us because we have a lot of important topics to discuss during the next half hour here on At Issue. And those important topics happen to be domestic and national or international. And the reason we're talking about those kinds of issues is because we have the congressman from Peoria with us. Darren LaHood, thank you so much for joining us.
H, great to be with you and your viewers.
Darren is a Republican representing the 18th Congressional District. Real quickly, the description of the district.
District covers all or parts of 19 counties. Goes from Peoria to Bloomington-Normal to Springfield to Jacksonville to Quincy to Macomb and all places in between. I border Missouri and Iowa, and it's a great district to represent.
Having described it, let's start with the economy. The economy, has recovered, in many people's minds has recovered, some not so much, but 5% unemployment rate nationwide. Yet the 18th Congressional District seems to struggle a little bit with jobs. What can you do in Congress to help that situation?
Well, I think there is still some anxiety with the economy in central and west central Illinois. And I think at the federal level, a couple things that we can do. I don't think the federal government should be in the business of creating jobs artificially, but we can be in the business of letting the private sector flourish. And how do we do that? I think tax reform is one area to do that. We're going to be debating tax reform when we get back into session later this spring and into the summer. We have not had comprehensive tax reform in this country in 30 years. The corporate and business tax rate in this country is about 36%. It's the highest in the industrialized world. By way of comparison, Canada has a tax rate of about 22% on businesses and companies and corporations. Ireland's at 14%. Again, we're at 36%. Under our proposal in the House, we bring that down to 20%. What that will do will help bring back a lot of companies and businesses that have parked overseas to bring them back, but it'll also give relief to small and medium-sized businesses, to LLCs, and to Main Street businesses. I think that can help. I think obviously fixing healthcare, the high cost of premiums and deductibles, fixing that can do that. I think the regulatory burden on our farmers, on our manufacturers, on our businesses, that's another area that I think can help with getting the economy going again. And the last part I will mention, H, is infrastructure. Infrastructure is the backbone of my district, whether it's roads and bridges, whether it's our locks and dams on the Illinois and Mississippi River. Those are vitally important to getting commercial products to market, but also getting people moved around the district. The new president has talked about a $1 trillion infrastructure plan. That not only helps our infrastructure, but helps Caterpillar, John Deere, other companies that produce products that help with that. Those are, I think, 4 areas that we can work on Congress to get the economy going.
Let's delve into those in a little bit more in depth, and let's talk about the funding for some of this. You mentioned infrastructure, a $1 trillion infrastructure program. That's going to create jobs. That's going to help Caterpillar. It's going to help John Deere. And where's the money coming from?
I think it's a fair question. The president in his joint address to Congress talked about the $1 trillion infrastructure plan. He talked about it a lot on the campaign. We've yet to see the details on that. I think part of it will be public-private partnership, which he mentioned in the State of the Union address. I think the public-private partnership, has some validity to it, and I think there'll be some support. But I don't think that is very helpful to a district like mine that is a rural district. When you think about public-private partnership, you have to have a return on that private investment. I think that works better in urban areas around the country, but not necessarily in a district like mine. So I think you have to have a funding source. In the past, we've raised the gas tax. We've looked for a user fee to find a way to fund infrastructure. I think the president, when he lays out his infrastructure plan, which I think will be later this year after we have healthcare reform and after we have tax reform, when we get to infrastructure, I think you have to have a funding source for that. So a number of those proposals that have been put forth, again, raising the gas tax with gas being low the way it is and having a user fee.
Are you in favor of raising the gas tax? Your father, when he was Secretary of Transportation, said it hasn't been raised since 1993. Let's do it. Do you favor that?
I think I want to look at the different proposals out there. I don't think you can just do it on gas tax, particularly with more vehicles that are electric vehicles, alternative fuel vehicles. I think you have to have a broader portfolio and perspective. I mean, cars are getting more and more efficient in terms of using fuel. So, eventually, if you raise the gas tax, that's not going to be able to fully fund infrastructure. I think you have to have a broader perspective. Again, looking at that general term of a user fee, how is that applicable to a Tesla or to a battery-operated car or a car that has high fuel efficiency? I think you have to look at all those things, but everything should be on the table.
And you mentioned lowering the corporate tax rate from 36 to 22%. That's a drop in income, I assume, for the federal government. How do you make up for that?
Well, we always have to remember we're $20 trillion in debt in this country. And that, if you think about it, in the last 10 years, we've gone from 8 trillion to 20 trillion. Part of that was the downturn in the economy, but you have to figure out how you're going to pay for these things, whether it's tax cuts, whether it's a $1 trillion infrastructure plan, whether it's building a wall that's going to cost $18 billion. How do you pay for it is important. And for tax cuts in particular, one of the proposals that makes the tax proposal, bringing it down to 20% revenue neutral, is something called the border adjustability tax. Somewhat controversial, but what that does is, in our tax proposal, it says if you're a net exporter, so if you're a Caterpillar, where you produce tractors over in East Peoria and you send those around the world, you're not affected by that. But if you are an importer, say you're a Walmart that produces a lot of products in Central America or Southeast Asia, and you bring them back in, you're going to be subject to a 20% border adjustability tax. Now, every other industrialized country in the world has that same tax when we put products into their country. It's called a VAT tax.
VAT.
VAT tax. Mm-hmm. This, our border adjustability, would harmonize that tax structure around the world, but that pays for bringing down that rate to 20% and makes it revenue neutral. And that's how you get to cutting those tax rates. But I want to make sure that we are always looking out for not adding to the deficit.
You mentioned the VAT tax, and Canada has it. Almost all nations have it, except for the United States. Let's turn our attention to trade agreements. Might that cause a problem, and what is your position on trade agreements, especially with NAFTA, the Pacific Rim one, et cetera?
Well, this is probably one area that I disagree with the president on. The president, talked in the campaign a lot about ripping up TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, redoing NAFTA, and having more fair trade. And I'm supportive of looking at trade agreements to make them fair. However, we also have to remember, in a district like mine, where I have the 9th largest agriculture district in the entire country, a third of the crops grown in Peoria County go somewhere else around the world, corn and soybeans. We rely heavily on trade. Trade equals jobs and economic opportunities, whether that's Caterpillar products, whether that's our corn and soybeans, whether that's John Deere products. We represent, in America, only 4.5% of the world's population. We have to have markets around the world. Our two biggest trading partners are Canada and Mexico. I don't believe NAFTA should be ripped up and redone. I think we can always look at how you can change it, make it more effective, efficient, and accountable. But I think you have to be very, very careful about ripping up trade agreements. Trade, if it's done the right way, again, equals economic opportunities for us. And so I think you've seen a little bit of a shift with the president in terms of trade, but we have to have markets around the world to produce our products. When TPP went down, the country that was doing backflips and was the biggest cheerleader was China. China will benefit from that. China will fill that void. Remember, TPP, which I was supportive of, was a trade agreement that would involve 11 different countries, but would reduce those barriers so that our products could go there and compete against China.
One of the other big issues that you mentioned at the front end of the program was health care. What is the status of the health care proposal from the Republicans, and what's your position on health care?
Yeah.
And I know that's a simple question and a complex answer, but...
Yeah. Well, a couple things about healthcare. I obviously wasn't in Congress when Obamacare or the ACA was passed back in 2010. But if we do nothing about the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, it is going to collapse. The trajectory that it is on, it's going to fail. So we have an obligation in Congress now to fix that. It's frustrating this has turned into a partisan issue, but if you remember during the presidential campaign last fall, even Hillary Clinton said we have to fix Obamacare, revise it, amend it to make it cost efficient. The trajectory that it is on right now is going to fail. So how do you do that? From my perspective, I think you look at what has worked in Obamacare. Being able to keep your kids on insurance until 25 or 26, a good thing, ought to be in there. Not discriminating against pre-existing conditions, making sure that is rock solid in there, has to be a part of that. But what we have to fix is premiums. The number one issue that I hear from my constituents is the high cost of premiums. For average middle class people in my district that have gone up 55%. The average premium has gone up 55% in my district. Deductibles have gone way up. So the argument is 20 million people have health insurance, but it's not affordable health insurance, And so we have to figure out how we make that affordable. So again, I don't think the government runs big things well. You take 1/6 of the economy, which is healthcare, you turn it over to the federal government. That has not been an efficient way to run healthcare. So I'm open to proposals that keep those core things that have worked in Obamacare, but change the structure to bring down premiums and deductibles. That's a complicated issue.
So repeal and replace is not what you're looking at?
Well, we got to replace it. There's no doubt about it. But there's, again, core issues that I think you have to keep in there. I think the plan that Paul Ryan came up with is a step in the right direction in doing that. Keeping in, again, pre-existing conditions and being able to keep your kids on insurance are in there. But driving down that cost for premiums, that affect businesses, that affect individuals, and affect, families, that has to change.
One of the reasons that the new health care proposal did not pass Congress was that the Republicans really aren't all in lockstep. And I'm not saying that Republicans should be in lockstep, nor am I saying Democrats should be in lockstep on all issues. But you had a significant advantage in the House, and it did not pass. So what's wrong with, why is there this split in the Republican Party on issues of that nature?
One observation, I think you will find that it was much easier to be an opposition party than a governing party, and we're finding that out. 240 Republicans in the House of Representatives. It was much easier, again, to vote no and to criticize. Now we have to govern and we have to fix problems. And that's the way I look at it is after the election, we got a new president who's a Republican. We have a House majority and a Senate majority, but we have no more excuses. We have to govern. We have to fix problems for the American people. And we have to do that in a conservative way on what we talked about. But obviously there's disagreement within the Republicans on how you do that. What parts of Obamacare you keep, which ones you get rid of. I don't think you can just scrap the whole thing, rip it up, and then start new. I think it has to be a transition. It's a complicated, nuanced issue, but there are core conservative principles to help drive down costs and help, with deductibles to make that better. I'm still optimistic that we will get a bill on healthcare to fix it. We've been working over the recess period here to do that. It's kind of like a family. You're not going to agree on everything, but you got to get into a room. You got to work it out with the new president and vice president. But there's no doubt it was a disappointment to not be able to do that.
Part of the health care bill was that there were congressmen who wanted to defund Planned Parenthood. What is your position on the funding of Planned Parenthood?
Yeah. I don't think any federal dollars should go to funding abortion. That's a view that I've ran on and had for a long time as a practicing Catholic and as a father of 3 kids with my wife. Abortion is an issue that I feel strongly about in protecting life. However, I will tell you that funding women's health care services is vitally important, something I believe strongly in. In Illinois, we have 36 women's clinics that help poor women and children with those type of services. I'm fully supportive of those. What I'm not supportive of is giving federal dollars to fund abortion, and that's what Planned Parenthood has done. So under our proposal, we shift those dollars. In my district alone, I have 11 clinics that supply those type of services to women for those services, and I'm going to continue to support those things. But I have some real difficulty with Planned Parenthood and the funding of abortion.
So you would withdraw all federal funding of Planned Parenthood regardless of the service it provides?
If they made a decision not to fund abortions, I would fund Planned Parenthood.
The Planned Parenthood in your district does not do abortions.
Well, there's 4 of them in my district that service my district. I believe that a number of those do provide abortion services.
Okay, the one in Peoria does not.
Yeah.
Let's go across the ocean. One of the things that has consumed a lot of airtime on news outlets is ISIS, North Korea, and Syria, and Afghanistan with the Moab bomb. Let's start with Syria. From your perspective, what role should the United States play in that civil war?
Yeah. First of all, I thought the president's response to the chemical attack on innocent children and women and men in Syria by President Assad was appropriate. I thought it was a measured response to target the airport where these planes that dropped the chemical weapons took off from. I thought it was the right response. I think he had broad support from both sides, Republicans and Democrats, on that. We have to remember Assad is a dictator. He wasn't democratically elected. He's a murderer. He's a thug. But Syria is a complicated issue. You have the underlying conflict between Sunni and Shia, between Iran and Saudi Arabia, that complicates the issue. I think in the end, the final solution in Syria is going to be you're going to have to divide the country eventually, but we can't get there while Assad is still in power. I don't think, and we heard Nikki Haley, the president's UN ambassador, say last week that any future Syria will not involve Assad. You cannot legitimize him and keep him in power in that country after what he's done to the people and the war crimes he's committed over there. It's not something that we can do. But I think in the end, you're going to have either a split or three different countries in Syria. But how do you get to that point? I think you have to have negotiation. You have to have everybody involved, from Russia to the United States to Iran to Saudi Arabia, and come to some agreement on how you divide the country and do that. But first and foremost, Assad has to go because of the continued engagement that he's been involved with killing his own people.
If Assad goes and the country cannot be divided, you might have a situation much as Saddam Hussein in Iraq, where there was a vacuum of leadership in the absence of Saddam Hussein. Are you worried about that in Syria?
Well, I think one of the mistakes we made in Iraq, and again, I wasn't serving in Congress at the time, but if you look at all the conflicts we've been involved with, since World War II, we've always kept a base in place or kept military installations in place after we, were victorious, whether that was in Japan or whether that was in Korea or whether that was in Germany. Look all around the world. I think it was a mistake to pull out our bases in Iraq when we did in 2009 and 2010. It didn't mean that we had to be engaged in warfare there, but keeping a base to secure the peace, I think, was a mistake there. And so I think you secure peace through strength. And frankly, I think we need to look at that further moving forward. But there's no doubt that look at Libya right now, look at Yemen. I mean, these are lawless states. They've disintegrated into, fiefdoms and clans and tribes that are fighting there. I mean, that's the direction I think Syria is headed in. So you got to figure out a mechanism, and it takes resources. It takes the players involved there to come in and rebuild these countries. One example, Lebanon went through a horrible civil war in the 1970s and 80s. Well, now it's a fragile government, but it's a government that is set up with Sunnis and Shia and Christians and Druze that have a government that each has a role in the government. And I think that's a good model to look at in terms of how you do that. I think Turkey, which has had some difficulties in the last year, but a secular Muslim country that has had somewhat of a democracy there. You have to look at examples like that to do that. We're a long way from that. I don't think you even get there while Assad is there. And I'm very, very critical of the Russians' involvement in Syria. I mean, you couldn't even get a UN resolution passed that condemned the gas attack because Russia vetoed it. That's unacceptable.
U.S. boots on the ground in any of these situations?
Well, I think we do right now. I mean, in Syria, we've continued to ramp up our special forces there. I think we'll eventually, after we take Mosul with the help of the Iraqis there, we're going to move into Raqqa and destroy ISIS there. I think we have an obligation to do that. We ought to be using our military to stop a larger war. If we can take these groups out tactically, that helps us in the long term to do that. I think special forces and a limited amount of ground troops are helpful as long as we're working with our allies in the region.
Let's go to another part of the world, North Korea. What do you do about that situation?
I think that's more complicated because you have South Korea, with a population base of 10 million in Seoul and about another 5 million surrounding there that is within 60 miles of the DMZ zone with North Korea. But you have obviously a rogue dictator with Kim up in North Korea. And, I know the president met with the Chinese premier. I think you have to have China's engagement. I mean, China kind of props up North Korea. We have to have engagement, but you can't have a dictator that continues to flaunt using nuclear weapons and missiles and the military armaments that he has. So I think you got to be very, very careful to engage North Korea in terms of the military. You can't go in and do a strike like you can in some other places, because I think you threaten close to 15 million people. So it's a more dicey situation. But I will tell you, I think the new president has some really smart military and intelligence folks around him. General Mattis is universally thought of as somebody that's been in warfare but understands the military. Our new CIA director, Mike Pompeo, the new National Security Advisor, McMaster. These are smart, bright people that understand the military and I think are giving the president good advice on this.
You mentioned Mike Pompeo. He was from Kansas. He was a congressman. And there was a race to replace him, and the Republican candidate won very narrowly. Now there is a primary. This program is being taped before it airs, so we will. By the time it airs, we would have known the result. But Tom Price, H&HS secretary, he's from Georgia's 6th district. That's solid Republican territory. That's Newt Gingrich territory. The race looks like it may be a Democrat who wins the primary. Is there a sign that the public might be turning against the Republicans in general? There are 6 congressional races, the one in Kansas and then 5 others.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we'll wait and see what happens with a couple of these races here. But there's no doubt we had a very divisive presidential election, probably the most divisive we've had in 50 years in our country. And we have a new president that many people didn't think was going to win, but he did. I think we got to give the new president a chance. I think you got to let him govern, get his cabinet in place, and start working on some of these issues. However, when you have the House controlled by Republicans, the Senate controlled by Republicans, and the president from the same party, we have these swings electorally in the United States. And, now that we're in power, it has energized the Democrats more so than they were before. And I think you're seeing a little of that now. I'm still confident with the vast majority of these special elections that Republicans will do fine in. But there's no doubt that it is the new president has caused people to be energized on the other side. And that's part of democracy.
So how do we fix Congress?
Well, I have a proposal that I've introduced with Dan Lipinski, a Democrat from Chicago, has a much different district than mine. But we got together and said, what can we do to fix the institution of Congress? We have very low ratings. We haven't passed a budget on time in 7 years. It seems like every year we're up against a fiscal cliff or defaulting or the government shutting down. We haven't passed all 12 appropriations bills in the House in 20 years. We've introduced legislation called the Congress of Tomorrow, which would set up a joint committee of Congress that would separately work on how we reform ourselves, make Congress more effective, efficient, and accountable. Right now, we don't have any mechanism or a platform or a committee to do that. Now, this is not something new. It's been done 3 other times in the last century. Last time was 1992. Legislation was passed to create a joint committee. What that is 12 senators, 12 House members, equally divided between Republicans and Democrats, that meet for a year or a year and a half to digest new proposals. How do we reform the budget process, the appropriations process? How do we make members spend more time together? This is a way we think to get Congress to be reformed and to work. In 1992, when this was last done, a bunch of proposals, numerous proposals were brought forth that were implemented in 1994 that helped get Congress back on track. We think now is the time to do that. We introduced our legislation about a month ago. We have 50 co-sponsors, equally divided between Republicans and Democrats, that we think is the right approach for how you fix Congress. We're optimistic we'll get it passed and get this committee going.
I can't let you go without asking a question about CPB, Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I believe it was a congressman from Colorado who introduced a bill to defund entirely CPB. What's your position on the Corporation for Public Broadcasting?
You know, public broadcasting, I think, serves a vital purpose in our country. I think it serves a vital purpose in my community that I represent. Obviously, the president's budget had drastic cuts there, but that's really a blueprint. That has to come to Congress now, and I look forward to being supportive with other members of Congress of making sure that those funds are appropriately put back into the budget to fund PBS, and I think we'll find a lot of bipartisan support for that. I think it's again, a vital service to my district and my constituents.
And with that, we are out of time. A half hour goes that quickly. Congressman Darren LaHood, a Republican from Peoria, representing Peoria and a portion of Peoria, and then to the west and southwest. Thank you so much for joining us on that issue.
Thanks, H.
And thank you for being with us as well. We'll be back with another edition of At Issue in the near future.